Hello. I find myself in the unusual position of being the warm-up act for a fireside chat. So it can only get warmer or hotter. I think we live in a strange time for the biomedicine and biotechnology. From the bench, things are looking quite rosy. Enormous developments in technical possibilities, gene therapies, big data diagnostic approaches. So things are looking quite rosy. And if we look at the field of cancer, it's looking increasingly fixable in due course. But there are problems. And obviously, as I say, being the warm-up act for a neurodegenerative chat afterwards, offset by the canapes, I hope. It's important to realize that Alzheimer's and other dementias are increasingly burdensome to the human species. It's currently estimated that about 50 million people are suffering from Alzheimer's and other dementias at this moment, and that by 2030 there'll be 82 million, and by 2050 allegedly there'll be 132 million people suffering with these devastating diseases. What are we going to do about it? And that's what we'll be listening to a little later on. Meanwhile, it's timely that the Institute of Public Policy has just pointed out, has just published data indicating that from their point of view, the last 10 years have been what they do call a lost decade for big pharma, essentially, in this country. And I've just been speaking with Barbara, who confirms that it is a shrinking sector within the United Kingdom. And in fact, there's evidence that the UK economy has lost 45 billion since 2010 due to this apparent shrinkage. So that's cause for concern. The loss of these large companies means that we're having fewer people being, in a sense, brought through and educated who might move on to smaller companies. I was just again talking to Barbara. It's a little bit like the BBC having lost its traineeships. So we got a problem of producing the talent to get through to the biotech companies. And the biotech companies actually are in vibrant health, and that's part of the good news we want to share with you this evening. And of course, Neuro-Bio is a good example of that. So what are we going to do about this, the problem that the sector as such is shrinking, while the technologies are in such rude health? And I'm hoping we'll be able to get a little bit of insight from various perspectives from our distinguished three panelists this evening. And I'm going to ask them to introduce themselves. I think we're starting off with Nick.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Nick Stevens. I run an executive search business in life sciences, building C-suite boards and leadership teams for academic medical research through to biotech and pharma. I also sit on the boards of a number of disruptive companies, including Neuro-Bio. So, good evening.
Hi, I think we might end up fighting over the microphone later. If it's so my name's Barbara Domain-Hayman. I'm originally a chemist by training, an Oxford chemist. And then I decided to go over to the dark side when I finished my PhD, and actually went into marketing with a big company where I stayed for about 11 years before having an early midlife crisis and going to business school, and then really discovering what I wanted to do, which was to do something entrepreneurial, but which also used my science background and my commercial training that I'd had. So I then went into biotech, and I've spent the last sort of 18, 19 years in biotech in a series of different companies in sort of entrepreneurial roles. So I've worked in business development, I've been a CEO, I've been a chair, I've been non-exec, At the moment, I have 4 different roles. So I'm entrepreneur in residence at the Francis Crick Institute, which is amazing. I'm also on 2 seed investment funds on their investment committees, and my kind of day job is I'm actually Chief Business Officer of a company called Autophony Therapeutics, which is developing drugs in central nervous system disorders. The clinical stage program is for schizophrenia, and we also have an early stage program for motor neuron disease and potentially for other dementias as well. So I know exactly how tough it is to work in this field at the moment.
Hi everyone, I'm Ricky Martin. I'm a biochemist, member of the Royal Society of Chemistry, but I never decided to go into pure science when I graduated. So I've spent the last 15 years supporting scientists across Europe, going into great companies to make great therapies and save as many lives as possible. So my part of the panel today is to talk more through people and the understanding of people, the involvement of people, the attraction, the development, the retention. And I build a business that's 60 heads now across the UK that focus purely in that area, hiring STEM people to find other great STEM people.
Thanks very much. I think I'd like to turn to Nick initially to give us a sense of the landscape, an overview of the landscape in this sector.
In central nervous system, or Alzheimer's. The biotech industry is dependent on a combination of 3 things. The first of those is prepared scientific minds. The second of those is the availability of enough funding to run the experiment. And we have to remember this is science, it's an experiment. And the third thing is problems to solve. And the good news in the UK and more widely is that all of those things are present in large numbers. There is enough investment capital out there. There are certainly problems to solve, and there are very well prepared minds. When you bring that together with the advances in information processing capability, what you end up with is a very vibrant ecosystem. The unusual change that's happened over the last 5 or 6 years sits in 2 places. The first one is that businesses very rarely try to become a biotech creative business. The disruptive business rarely tries to become a business that actually delivers product to patients anymore. So there's an ecosystem where large pharma will buy biotechs at the point of proof of concept. The second big change is the appetite for risk of the investment community, and a change from primarily venture funding to a blend of charitable support, not-for-profit support, so other academic institutions, the high net worth ecosystem where people have family and friends who have been suffering from a disease and they care enough to make an investment that may be high risk but will have high impact if it succeeds, and then into a later phase venture capital world. So generally the world is a good place for innovative, disruptive science.
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, I think lots of rich themes there. I totally agree that the business model has really changed. I mean, now pharma increasingly buys in the innovation and has, in some cases, given up on trying to do it themselves. And I think one of the very sad announcements yesterday, actually, was that Eli Lilly announced that they're actually going to close down their Neuroscience site in Earlwood, which was actually the last big pharma site on devoted to neuroscience in the UK, which is a real blow, I think, to the industry. Also, I think, to neuroscience as a whole, because it sends a bad signal. I mean, Lilly have had many failures, and I think that's really why they've done it. There's also an opportunity there, because it means that they're going to be buying in those innovations from the biotech sector. So, you know, there are opportunities here for smaller, more innovative companies to come up with those solutions. So I think that's very positive. I think another theme that Clive, I think, brought out very interestingly was the one of training the next generation. I think where pharma companies in the past have really been very good at training, they've spent a lot of money on training medicinal chemists, on people who really know how to do drug development. I think biotech companies, obviously, it's difficult for them to afford to spend those sorts of amounts of money on training. And I think we're going to have to train the next generation in different ways. And that's something that I'm certainly very involved with in my role at the CRIC, I'm involved in 2 programs. One is the Pulse program, which is a program for up-and-coming life science entrepreneurs. I didn't think of that acronym, but somebody clever did. And it's basically aimed at first-time CEOs, usually those who've come from an academic setting, to give them a real boot camp training on what it's like to be a CEO. And the other thing I'm involved with is something called KQ Labs, which is an accelerator. Again, the point that was mentioned, I think, Nick, you mentioned this point where data science and biomedical are increasingly forming a very exciting interface where there's a lot going on. And KQ Labs is an accelerator which is specifically aimed at fostering startups at that interface and actually training those startups and helping them to develop. So I think, training the next generation of entrepreneurs is something that I feel very, very passionately about.
And if I can just jump on top of that, I think when we're looking at the next generation of entrepreneurs, we're also looking at the next generation of talent to work for those entrepreneurs as well. Because the reality is, not to go against investment and people starting up, not everyone is right to set up a firm from nothing. Sometimes it's great to go into growing firms, understand how those firms grow, what their focus is, what their missions are, and understand the life cycle of growth of a company to then go into businesses further down the line about where they can bring talent. I mean, the great news of the market, particularly in the UK, and for me right now, is there is that real hunger and appetite to work for an SME or a startup or a new business. It's not all about working for a big pharma company anymore. Yes, the big farmers might have the brand and the name and the global opportunity to present to their talent, but they also have a very clear track record of putting people into boxes, and that's where they operate. So going into startup firms and actually being able to see multidisciplines within a company, work directly for the leader, the CEO who owns, lives and breathes that vision, is producing the entrepreneurs that we need and giving people time to decide if that's what they want. And I think one thing that I always, we've spoken about this before and I talk about it a lot, I think there's something there's not just, if we're looking at a company starting, access to money in this sector is possible. There's lots of ways to do it. Not everyone's going to get it, but there's lots of ways of doing it. How successful those companies are going to be is dependent upon the people within them, dependent upon the culture that's set at the top and the people who come through there. And I've got to say the workforce is changing, the way that people expect the workforce to support them, for them to want them to join their firm as much as they want to join the firm. There's a big mindset change in talent that's coming into the market. I always think the people we're training today are our leaders of tomorrow, and we need to adapt to the mindsets that they have right now in order to grow successful businesses.
Thanks very much for those very useful overviews. I think it would now be interesting to get your ideas about whether there are particular challenges for the sector that's trying to address the problems of dementia and Alzheimer's.
Well, the first one is that CNS problems, the brain is the most complex thing that we know about today. Each cubic millimeter of your brain contains about a petabyte of data. That's about 1 million computer processors in every cubic millimeter of your brain. So diseases of the brain tend to be emergent. The second problem is that they tend to be classified in terms of 1950s disease classifications. So schizophrenia is one disease, Alzheimer's is one disease, rather than in terms of their biological underpinning. What that means is that it's very difficult to run a large late-phase trial in CNS. You need a large number of patients, you need to track them for a long time. That costs a lot of money. So it's incumbent on new businesses to find different ways to define disease. That's becoming easier. Genetics helped. And it's also incumbent on us to design better experiments and to develop new diagnostics that help us to characterize these diseases with a surrogate marker and to characterize them early. And if we can do both of those things, then we can help the regulators to understand both that the product works, and second, that it's going to be safe in a wider population, and third, that that wider population is going to be defined as a group of people in whom the drug will work. So this is where drugs and diagnostics come together to allow us to create personalized medicines with a much higher likelihood of success in the individual patient, and therefore a better health economic argument for bringing them to market.
Great. Yeah, I think lots of interesting points there. I mean, I think you're right. I mean, phase 3s are so massively expensive in this sort of neurodegeneration field. I think we're already seeing a lot of innovation there, actually, even amongst the mature pharma companies, where they're sharing resources. There are, dementia platforms for, actual cohorts of patients available. So they are trying to collaborate because this is such a tough area and it's so expensive. I mean, I think one of the other points that's really important is if we think about the amount of progress that's been made in treatment for cancer over the last 20 years, it's been absolutely astounding. And that's because so much money has gone into that field. And so we've really made scientific breakthroughs about the understanding of the disease, and that's in turn attracted more funding. And if you now look at the biotech sector, it's probably about 60% of it is actually funding oncology programs by venture capital firms. So what we really need is that level of investment to go into neurodegeneration, because if we can actually start to get the scientific breakthroughs really moving, that will in turn attract more investment, and we'll get the same positive spiral going that we've had in the oncology field. And we desperately need that as a society, because I think, as Clive said, if we don't sort out all these neurodegenerative problems, we're going to be bankrupt as a society. And I think, the government's done some interesting things here. They were, I think, one of the founders of the Dementia Discovery Fund, which is a fund that's particularly focused on dementia, which is a great thing. And I mean, that's a really good fund. And in fact, the DDF invested in Ortiphany in our program very, very early on. But it's one fund, and that's not enough. We need very much more funding to come into this sector, really, to address it. And I mean, I think that Lily getting out of this sector was really a bit of a wake-up call. So we need much more funding.
If I just jump onto the funding side, I think when I think of, as I've grown up and I've studied and I've gone into industry, the reason why there's oncology is having the breakthroughs, yes, is the money, but also the way it's been marketed. If you think of Cancer Research UK, everybody knows that's a charity they can put money in and try and help people. But I would say, I mean, last year my granddad passed away to dementia. So for me, it's been something quite paramount to me. And I've done a lot of work with Alzheimer's in different places to support this. But I don't think there are enough ambassadors for this area of science. I think if everybody was to take a message home that, do they in their businesses, are they running dementia awareness weeks or whatever weeks there are to raise awareness to the sector? Yes, the scientific breakthroughs will come through, which will attract the money. But if we can do more fundraising, or we all take a personal responsibility, because I can't remember the exact touch points, but it's something like 1 in 3 of us will all experience, if not every other person, will experience one of these diseases at one point in our life. That I don't think there's enough. Let's take all scientists out the window who are aware about these things. The general consumer out there who thinks, I'm going to put some money into a charity somewhere and I'm going to hope to help someone's life because it's a good thing to do, or I can write it off on my tax assessment or something. Oncology's grabbing it all, and we need to be doing more and more we can to market personal ambassadors in the space, personal stories. We need to be getting a lot of that money to make this the sexy charity, or the charities, should I say, to support, because it's been dominated by oncology. And that's what we need to do. And I think great scientists can talk about the science and the need of it and the importance of it, but it's how we translate that message to the general consumer and the general person on the street. That's the thing that I think we need to tackle quickest and hardest, whether it is our personal missions, whether it's the businesses, whether the companies we work for, and we are asking them to use their corporate social responsibility programs, their CSR programs, and make sure that actually almost every one of them has Alzheimer's dementia as a staple charity. I don't think that's happening enough, and I think that's going to underpin everything we want to succeed in here.
Yeah, just add to that, I mean, I totally agree. I mean, if you think about Cancer Research UK, they fund the most enormous amount of basic research now in the UK. But actually, that's because, punters like us actually give them lots of money, and they're able to fund that amazing research. So I totally agree. We've got to get normal people to actually donate to Alzheimer's charities.
There's a word that popped up on the screen earlier, disruptive. I have to say it's an adjective that I don't feel entirely comfortable with. If I were describing, for example, Susan and her contribution to science, I'd use words like original and adventurous, and successful in pursuing the hypotheses insofar as she's tested them, and they withstood those tests. I think you can end up being disruptive. But you can't set out, rather, if you set out to be disruptive, it's not going to work. This isn't like, being a punk in the late 70s trying to overthrow progressive rock. If you try to do that in science, it's not going to work, because you are building on the strength of the giants beforehand, and maybe showing that some of their precepts were incorrect. And I think Susan has done a great job in showing that the amyloid hypothesis in Alzheimer's is unsatisfactory, it's insufficient, and therefore we have to go down a different path. So I would credit her with words like original. There's a question from the floor.
Yeah, I'm just thinking, lots of topics to pick up on, really interesting discussion. I'm thinking about, is there any tension or conflict between, by the time you've set up, we talked about business and entrepreneurs, of which the idea is to make money, and of course the science and the helping people. I imagine there comes a point, or there could be points, where there could be a conflict there. There are maybe corners to cut that would save money, or a marketing thing that would actually get this out to more people, but that might not be the very, you know what I'm saying. So how do you, in your position of straddling both the science and in the position as CEOs and entrepreneurs, how do you manage that? Or is it not an issue?
I think we'll all probably throw an answer out to this one, but there is a balance, don't get me wrong. If people are setting up a business, it's a commercial entity, right? And if I'm not wrong in what you're saying is, they're trying to make money to run the business to make a difference, but if they're making a difference, why are they focusing on the money? It's the conflict between those two parties. Is that where we're going here?
It's a little bit tempting. You might see an opportunity to make money, which might not be the best thing for the science or the end customer, the patient.
It depends on the business's future, isn't it? It depends if their ambition is to take the product to a certain phase and then sell it to another business to take it further with the resources they have. It depends if one thing I think we need to remind ourselves in science is ultimately most people are coming out of the innovations aren't coming out of the innovations unless they're big pharma purely for the cash. They're coming out of the innovations because something that's deeper inside them that they want to make the difference. And are they? As somebody who doesn't run a biotech firm, but are they really going to be able to get a product which is to help someone to market by cutting lots and lots of corners? Are the regulators going to stamp it down when it gets there? Are the quality standards going to prevent it from happening? There are, I would believe, particularly in this country, enough guidelines to put some protection in if you're sitting there thinking, am I going to cut corners here to benefit us here? But I still think that the scientific interest of making a difference and saving lives will always prevail with startups. I can see you edging to say a question in the corner there.
No, do you want to go next? I don't know.
This is an eternal problem. Is there a conflict between profit and and the invention of new drugs? And the answer is no. They're interdependent. We only fund new drug development by having the money to do it, and that's a necessity. It's just a fact. Wherever that money comes from, you can pretend that third sector money is in some way higher quality, but in the end it's what's left over after people have earned some money, paid some tax, and then chosen to give it to the third sector. So the money is an essential piece. I do think this drives towards the stage at which businesses should become publicly quoted, though, because in the creative part of biotech, you're running an experiment that takes a minimum of 7 years and usually 14. You have a hypothesis, you've got to take that through to a demonstration of utility and safety. And that means you only get news every few months at best, every few years is more likely. So I personally believe that anybody who IPOs before they have proved their concept is making a mistake, because what they then need to do is produce news at least on a 3-monthly cycle. And they can't, and that's where bad behaviour starts, because then they become dependent on their share price, not dependent on their runway. I'm balancing on the head of a pin here, but so if you are looking at a drug discovery and an early development company, and it's a public company, be wary. If you're looking at a company post proof of concept, then I think it's very sensible for that to go out to the public markets for the capital it needs to run the next phase.
Thanks. Yeah, I mean, I think it's an interesting question. I think most people who go into our sector actually do it because they want to do something that's actually useful. So you actually get up in the morning and you feel good about going into work and that you're doing something that ultimately might actually help people. So I think that's kind of a nice starting point. But and I think also, generally speaking, if you do really good science, then that's going to get recognised. It needs to be science that is meeting an unmet medical need, though, for it to actually attract investment and for ultimately to make money. So you can't just do science that's not actually going to be solving a problem that we all need to address. I think ultimately, obviously, the investors in the companies, I mean, as you say, whether they're private or they're public, ultimately the investors will determine what your exit is, and if you get it to proof of concept and then you have to sell the business. That's very common in the UK, but that's basically the business model you probably sign up to when you take those investors that money. So I think it's kind of fair enough, and it's okay. It's disappointing that we sell a lot of companies at proof of concept stage, but actually the people in those companies get recycled and they do it again, and so I don't actually think it's too much of a problem.
Can I add to that? If you're also looking at it like that, if you put yourself in the mindset of the person working in the company, and you come from science and you care about what that company stands for, the minute the company is cutting corners for commercial value or commercial gain is the minute, I believe, all of those people lose interest in the firm, fall out of love with the culture of where they're going, and ultimately go to join another business that is going to fulfill what they need. So in a way, science will, like, it sounds a big picture thing, science will safeguard itself because people within it do notice these things. And I actually think, I mean, yes, we're looking at the guys at Eli Lilly, where do they go next? But we're looking at great minds here. The science community will be able to rehome them into another opportunity. So I think the people within the firm will leave if they're seeing that practice. And if anybody is seeing that practice in their firm, controversial or not, I'd recommend going elsewhere. You don't want to be the person working for a firm cutting corners and putting patients' lives in danger one day, potentially.
Just picking up on that, one sort of last topic from me before we have a few questions from the floor. What are the factors that make you identify a company, a biotech company, as a successful, well-designed, well-constructed company?
I'll pass over to you then, the best person to answer.
Gosh, a well-designed, first it has to have a clear purpose. And I think that divides into three places. The first one is we are here to cure Alzheimer's. And we don't mind what approach we take to that. The second is we have a platform, a technology that has multiple applications. And what we're going to do is refine and increase the number of those applications so that we can benefit patients in that way. And the third is I have a scientific hypothesis, and I'm going to test it, and if I prove it, then the outcome will be the end of Alzheimer's, the end of whatever disease state it is you're thinking of. That's first. The second one then is when companies foresee, I tend to think in organization charts, and many companies know that there are a number of stages and a number of transitions to make, and then imagine the company looking the same tomorrow as it did today. And we have to recognize that there are horses for courses, and people who are fantastic at one thing might not be fantastic at another thing. So people who understand the contribution that the people are going to make and how they're going to maximize the chance of that drug or therapy getting to a patient who needs it are the people who evolve their organization along the way. So we're back to those three things. The CEO's job, number one, is to set the purpose. Number two is to make sure there's enough money there to achieve the purpose. And number three is to make sure the right team is in place to do the things that achieve the purpose.
Yeah, I mean, I always think about, when I think about biotech firms, I always think about having 4 pillars. So I think basically there's the technology, the science that it's doing. There's basically the unmet need that it's actually meeting. There are the people, and there's the money. And I mean, success actually, you can measure success on each of those parameters. But at the end of the day, I think there's only one real success for a biotech company, and that's patient impact. I think if you actually deliver something that's changing people's lives, that's actually what the success is all about. And if you do that, then the other things will flow from that, I think.
Yeah, no, I'll simplify it. If I was thinking what makes a successful biotech company, of course, supporting the patient, providing unmet medical needs, having access to money and having the right vision. It is the purpose. Is the business going in the right direction? Because if it's going in the right direction, it's authentic. I think not just we're trying to change lives. Everybody says that in science. Is it an authentic need and an authentic vision you're going with? People will invest into you. But if I was to walk into any company and literally walk through the atrium or however big or small it is and seeing that everybody in that workforce is happy and saying hello, to me that tells me that they're a well-designed, well-structured biotech or any company of any sort, because the people are engaged in what they're doing. And they can only be engaged by having access to money, access to the right person. That's what it comes to in simple terms to me. Is it a happy workforce that are engaged with where they're going, know where they're going? And you can ask anyone. You can ask the person on the front desk. You can ask the person almost dropping off the post to that business. They'll probably know what that business stands for. That's a well-structured by any company, any business whatsoever. If it has that, it will succeed.
Thanks. Have we got time for a couple of questions from the floor? Yep. There's a hand up back there.
Can I just mention on the large charities, probably going to large charities is 80% or so is taken as administration costs, etc. If you give direct investments, you get your EIS back of 33%. So it's actually all value going to the young company. What we need is some sorts of platforms that officially recognise good pharma companies that we can invest in as investors that are proper companies.
I think that was addressed at me, right? I agree. We'll start there. The problem with many charities is that they believe that they're doing good work because their intent is good, and those two things are not always the same. However, there are plenty of charities out there who do good work and that you can donate to with some degree of confidence. I entirely agree that investing your own money in a business that you believe is going to do some good is important. One has to recognise that this is science, and the purpose of science, if you read your Popper or whatever, is to posit a theory and then actively to encourage others to disprove it. So you have to recognise that some of these experiments do not work, and therefore that you have burned your money, but you've burned your money increasing the sum of human knowledge and giving the next one a better chance. You then talked a little bit about tax. I know that there are moves afoot to try to create some multi-generational tax-efficient investment vehicles in the UK, and I hope this happens. If it does, then it might well be possible for you to invest money in a fund that has identified a group of good companies to invest in, and for the people whoever you choose to inherit your money, to inherit that free of tax, as long as the purpose remains that long-term scientific endeavour. So I hope that we'll have some new structures to do that with soon.
I mean, just picking up on one part of that question, which is interesting. I think it's always very difficult, especially when companies are at an early stage, to attract venture capital investment, and that's where actually business angels are extremely important, sometimes to get a company going. And it's very difficult for business angels to find the right companies, and it's also very difficult for the startup companies to find the business angels. So it's a bit of a random process at the moment, which is very inefficient. And there are some networks of angels which are kind of becoming more established. I mean, there's Cambridge Angels, there's Neuro-Bio. There are a few networks that actually do focus on this kind of thing. But, I think we do need more in that area, and a bit more maybe structure, because it's an inefficient and somewhat wasteful process in terms of energy on both sides. And, startup companies can benefit enormously from business angel funding.
I don't think there's much more I can add to what you both have, other than there's always that element of risk, is what we're saying. If you're putting the money in, is it a safe bet at the end of the day? And I think the honest answer is as many provisions can be put in place to try and safeguard it, and more needs to be done. But I think that's the whole point. It's always going to be a risk, isn't it? It's always going to have an element of uncertainty. And absolutely, I guess the question is, what can we do to make it more, to give you a greater chance at confidence in putting money in the right places? I think that'll always be a question that goes around for a while.
Thanks. I think just one more brief question, please. Yes, the lady there.
So unfortunately, I don't have the source, and I feel terrible by not having the source and quoting a statistic, but I was at a meeting last week where someone sort of made the blanket statement saying, if we said tomorrow curing all cancer, then that would add a life expectancy of 2 years on the US population. From a neurodegenerative perspective and from, say, a longevity perspective, that sounds quite achievable in some ways. But, actually, I think we have this idea that neurodegeneration, we're going to be adding, does it need to be 10 years? Does it need to be 15 years? Does it need to be 2 years? Well, actually, as you say, all the funding that's gone into oncology, we've achieved this blanket 2 years if you average it all out. Whereas, I think that we perhaps beat ourselves up a little bit and maybe need to talk about actually some of the successes that we're having, and also think more realistically about what success actually looks like. So I don't know if you could kind of comment on that.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting point. I think, with neurodegeneration, success would actually be if we managed to delay the disease by even a couple of years, so people can live independent and fulfilling lives for a couple of years longer than they currently do before they get into a state where they have to go into a care home or whatever. So I agree. I think success isn't necessarily just curing the disease. It's actually making, relatively modest improvements will have a very, very enormous impact on people, but also on society. So I agree.
You hit the nail on the head. It's about quality of life. The cancer endpoints, some of them are very unusual. Would I like to live an extra 2 or 3 months, which you can get a drug registered for, sedated with opium and unable to interact with the world or my family? No, I wouldn't. I'd rather die. I've watched 3 close relatives be dehumanized by Alzheimer's. They've turned from people I love to people who aren't people. The opportunity to give people a few more years of being people is absolutely what it's all about. Absolutely.
I'm just sitting there thinking, what could you do with those extra few years of your life? If we're actually thinking about trying to show some successes, and I think the point we're making is, why aren't we making a bigger thing out of that than maybe has been made out? What could we do with our life in 2 years, or even 2 extra months? I could give you some incredible things I'd love to do in that 2 years, and that's the story we should be building behind it. Because, wow, if we can have those 2 more years of our loved ones, what an amazing world that would be, just to have that moment. And what an amazing, if that's the exact stat, what an amazing stat that is. And ironically, I hadn't even heard that stat until you just said it, which probably tells part of our story making and what the small successes can mean to bigger pictures for people.
Well, I think that's a very positive note on which to end this part of the evening before the Star Act. I'd just like to thank our panelists for their contributions this evening.
Yeah, you leave that there.
Okay. Okay. No fire. Okay.
Okay, great. Well, as has been trailed, well, first of all, I should say thank you very much, Clive, and to the panelists for a fascinating discussion just then. That was great. And it's a fireside chat with no fire. I feel like as a creative business, as an advertising agency, we should have a gif of a fire somewhere playing in the background in its stead, but alas, we don't. Look, just to begin with, maybe most of you will know Susan very well, but I do feel I should just quickly introduce Susan before we start the conversation tonight. So please, it's brilliant to have Susan on the stage for the conversation tonight. Many of you will know her, Baroness Susan Greenfield, CEO and founder of Neuro-Bio. An amazing CV, which I'm clearly not going to do justice to on the stage right now, but published over 200 different peer-reviewed papers over the course of her career, published numerous different books, holds a total of 32 honorary degrees from UK and foreign universities, which is particularly impressive, and has received numerous honours, including the Légion d'honneur from the French government, the Honorary Fellowship for the Royal College of Physicians, the Australian Research Society Medal, etc., etc. So it's a very humbling set of achievements, and it's brilliant to have her on stage. So please welcome Susan tonight. And look, tonight is really a conversation between us and to hear a little bit about the journey of Susan's business, but also to talk about the relationship that we've had in a business context, and really what is the role of marketing as a component in the growth of a relatively nascent business. So I think maybe the first point is to start and ask Susan, what drove you to set up Neuro-Bio? Tell us a bit about the journey.
Okay, well, first of all, can I thank Jason and BMB for this partnership and this collaborative work, which I'm finding really exciting. And I think all the Neuro-Bio team are finding this huge fun, working with such a different sector to that which scientists are normally used to. So the way it started was I was a standard issue Oxford academic, doing my stuff. And I didn't aim to set up a company at all. But like often in life, and I'm sure most of you have had this experience, things just happen and you just have an opportunity and you go with it. And so what happened was that we had this idea that was gradually becoming more and more clear as to what it could mean for Alzheimer's. And so eventually we designed an experiment that then led to the filing of a patent. And that's when we had a slight run-in with Oxford University as to who owned the intellectual property, which we won for reasons I won't bore you with, but it did mean that we then went to the private sector, and it wasn't something that was a particular strategy or plan, but it was rather like a sort of billiard ball going from one thing to another. You just respond to certain scenarios, and this is the best thing that ever happened to me, but it's really exciting to do this.
Fantastic.
Yeah.
And I know there are lots of wonderful posters around just demystifying, and for people like me, what is the actual science behind what you're developing? And maybe for the audience, you could give us your simplified version, which I know is very good. So.
Sure. Okay, so the slightly less simplified version you can see as posters as you come in. There's also a goodie bag which contains information about the company. But to sum up 40 years' work in one sentence, we have a new approach to Alzheimer's where we suggest that the whole problem has been that no one has really identified the actual mechanism driving neurodegeneration. In our arrogance, we think we have, and that mechanism is an inappropriately activated form of development. So whilst development is a great thing in the embryo, if it's inappropriately activated, we are suggesting it leads to neurodegeneration. And so that's it in a nutshell. And why we're different is that most people tackling Alzheimer's have tackled the sequelae, things like amyloid, which you've heard of. We actually ask, why is it only certain cells are dying? What is special about them? And we don't think anyone else has asked that question, and we have. And the answer is on the posters at the entrance.
Yeah. And it's fascinating to hear. One of the things I'm curious about, and we've talked a lot about it in our interactions, is this, you see lots of headlines, the cure for Alzheimer's, cure for cancer. And so how do you kind of balance, expectation and hope, and what's the dynamic there to the less informed audience?
Yeah, I think this is one of the biggest challenges, because on the one hand, you want to give people hope, but you also want to contain realistically expectations, and it saddens me a lot when you see this latest cure, and so the general public will think it's going to happen tomorrow. So what I always say to people is we're on the case. It won't happen tomorrow, but we are on the case. We have got some ideas. It's not like some hypothetical unicorn that we're trying to invent. We are actually on a track, but it won't happen tomorrow. But nonetheless, we are trying, and we're trying really hard, because, as was eloquently expressed by the panel, this really is an unmet need that is devastating. And it's not so much to the patients, because after a while they lack insight into their condition. It's to the carers. Imagine being married to someone for 30 or 40 years, the love of your life, And there they are, doubly incontinent, not recognizing who you are. Imagine, whereas with cancer or heart disease, you're still the person you were. Whereas, as Nick said, suddenly, somehow you feel a sense of loss. And for many of the carers, they're going through a bereavement process that is not acknowledged by society because they're experiencing a sense of loss, but because the person concerned is still breathing, that's not acknowledged by society. So quite often carers will say, it's a living death. That's a phrase I've heard a lot. And those are the people we're reaching out to. That is what keeps me awake in the mornings. No, it makes me get up in the morning, keeps me awake at night, which is to actually try and help in some small way if we can. Yeah.
And that, in some ways, may be the answer to my next question, which is, if you look forward to the future of Neuro-Bio, so where are you going? And if you kind of 5 years' time, and you go, what does a great outcome look like for your business?
So we have four assets that we would love to see promoted. The first is a blood test. So imagine being able to go to the doctor, like you might for a cholesterol test, at any age, and they're saying, well, actually, there's good news and bad news. The bad news, I'm afraid, you have a marker in your blood that indicates in 5 years' time or 10 years' time, you could get neurodegeneration. We know the process starts 10 to 20 years before you get the symptoms. If you could identify that in advance, that would be a huge advance, even with existing medication. But imagine if the doctor then said, but the good news is we have a medication that stops any more cells dying, that stabilizes the loss. Again, if you already had the diagnosis, that would be really helpful. But imagine if you hadn't got the symptoms, but you had advance warning of 5 or 10 years that you were going to, you could take the medication there and then you'd never get the symptoms. So that's the first. Then our other assets are the idea of an animal model, which doesn't sound very glamorous, but another problem bedeviling Alzheimer's research is there's no tests that people can use to test out their drugs in rats and mice, and we think we have that. And the final application is, even we say that neurodegeneration is an inappropriate form of development, that is, of course, what cancer is. And we have an application to metastases, to stopping the spread of cancer and to detecting it. So where I'm very excited is because we have a basic idea, and this is an idea that came from when I was an academic, it actually spawns 4 different applications. All of which for Neuro-Bio, if we can have all 4 of them going, that would be wonderful, but any one of them would be a great advance.
Right. And clearly, the human outcome, potential human outcome, is a huge part of what, as you say, gets you up in the morning and makes you stay awake late at night, et cetera, et cetera. But what are the challenges? And it's speaking a little bit to the conversation we just had around the challenges in this sector. There's obviously the excitement and the possibility, and where do you see the biggest issues?
Okay, the biggest challenges are, contrary to what you might think, scientists are not completely open-minded. They're very conservative with a small c. And imagine if you've been working on something for 5, 10, 20 years, it's like your kid, it's something you really care about, and along comes someone else like me and says, actually, you know what, you're wrong. I've got a better idea. How are you going to feel about that? You're not going to say, fine, It's a fair... You're obviously going to have some sales resistance, and part of the issue that one confronts is the understandable cynicism and sales resistance bred by normal science. Now, this notion of a paradigm shift, which was introduced by someone called Thomas Kuhn, which was that in science what happens is you go along with the dogma, but gradually anomalies, there seems to be anomalies, things that don't quite make sense, and you shove them under the carpet. The anomalies carry on coming. And then eventually you have to say, no, look, it's enough, it's a fair cop. All these anomalies means we have to challenge the dogma. That is when you have what's called a paradigm shift. And I feel we're now in the status for Alzheimer's of a paradigm shift. In my conceit, I think that Neuro-Bio is well positioned for this paradigm shift. But then I'm obviously biased for this.
Good biased, it's okay. So what I thought we could do is maybe switch gear a little bit to talking a bit about the selling of the business, the selling of science more broadly, to think a bit about how marketing plays within that role. And obviously, we have worked together a little bit.
We've worked together a long time.
Way,
just so the audience know, we've known each other for about 15 years in different guises.
Terrifying.
When we were 5 years old,
maybe.
Obviously.
But obviously you started to think a little bit, and obviously we then started to work together. You started to think about the role of marketing.
Sure.
Is there a kind of particular moment on your journey where you actually thought, this thing that we may have done less of suddenly becomes a kind of need for the business.
Sure. It's as I've made the jump from the public to the private sector, I'm aware that when you're talking to investors, you can't just brainstorm and blitz them with all the science, that what they need is somehow a way in which they can understand it and the way that you can really express the ideas in a accurate but nonetheless clear and non-specialist way, and that's where marketing comes in. I mean, for example, BMB have helped us with our logo, which they're very sniffy about our previous logo, and now we have this new logo.
We were super complimentary.
I know. Yeah. So even something, I won't say as simple as, but something as direct and as basic as the logo is something that, for me as an ex-academic, is something that one wouldn't traditionally have thought of, but thanks to you, we're able to consider, and we can see the importance of that.
Great. And I'm also interested in, because one of the debates here is about the professionalisation and presenting a modern face for science to the outside world. And it strikes me, again from the outside, that science, it's the pursuit of a very pure purpose. And sometimes there is a sort of sense of contamination with marketing, and I'm being hard on myself for a minute. But what are the issues around that? Because if you look at technology, it's interesting how technology has learnt to market itself extremely well. But is that the case with science, and what journey do we need to go with science?
Often science is the last resort. It's considered the nerdy thing and so on, and it's a death knell at a party if you say you're a scientist. People don't come back, or they say they're going to get you a drink and they don't come back because it's a kind of the ultimate challenge. And I think we do have an image problem, and that's why working with companies such as yours can actually start to unlock that. Someone asked me, another scientist here said, have you worked a lot with biotech companies? And I said, I think we were the first. But I think this is a very healthy relationship to encourage, because it is a win-win situation. It's great for you in terms of the challenge and the creativity that science poses, plus the social need. And at the same time, it's good for the scientists because it means we're much more attractive to investors if we can package ourselves in a way that people are comfortable with.
Yes. Yeah. I think, one of the other reflections we had, I think, the other day is, you invited us down to the office in Oxford and said, what do you think of the, should we be doing it differently? Should we do something different with the reception area? And I think what was interesting, is sometimes, and this happens, that there is a misperception that marketing is the gloss or the superficial bit that sells the product or the service. And I think what was fascinating for us in the conversation is the real substance of this company and this business is what happens in the lab.
Sure.
And actually, don't think about it as the front of house and the back of house. Actually find the thing that is the truth about you, and that isn't necessarily
and that
gossip.
actually is good for us, because that makes us really question, what are we seriously about? And it's very easy to hide behind jargon. It's very easy to go for the trees, not the wood. And really you want to go for the wood. And I think that working with a company such as yours makes you actually say, what are we about? What is our mission? What's our theme? How are we different? What's our unique selling point? And those questions are not the kind of questions we ask every day in the lab. But when you actually stand back a little bit and work with a marketing company, it makes you actually think about those things. So it's not just a way of selling ourselves, but it's a way of actually articulating what we're about, which I think is important.
Yeah. And I think... and I recall the exercise, I think just the exercise of thinking about what are the things that you stand for, your values, what is your purpose, to the point beforehand, that's all bound up in your mind and in your colleagues. It's actually very helpful to articulate that in an objective way when you're recruiting new people.
Sure.
And I think that was,
well, certainly when we're talking to investors in the private sector. But I could ask you back, Jason, what are the challenges particularly for you of working with the scientists? See, everyone finds this funny. Yeah? So what are the challenges that you have?
I think it's to the point that maybe I mentioned before, is there is a misperception, potentially a misperception, that marketing is somehow changing the substance of what the company is about and the intent of the company. And I would say, look at all of the brands that we love and kind of buy, whatever the space is. There is an authenticity about those brands, and you don't try and hide any elements. And I think probably that there's a little bit of kind of grappling with that. And also marketing has its, like any business. I mean, I listened to the debate tonight, and I know maybe 10% of some of the scientific discussion, marketing has jargon, and I think that's how do we make sure that the intersection of those two things kind of works, and people understand what we're trying to do within the business.
And have you found scientists harder to work with than?
Who, sorry?
Have you found scientists hard to work with
Harder
compared
to
to
work
normal
with?
human beings? Are we harder? There's something strange about it.
The rationality is good. You can give me a good reason why you don't like it, and you tell me very directly, so that's kind of fine.
Okay.
What was else I was going to ask you? So the other theme that I just wanted to briefly explore around marketing was this idea of storytelling as well.
Oh, totally.
And just thinking about, you started to tell a story of the science, but marketing is ultimately about just telling good stories to people.
Sure.
And I think one of the things, through metaphor, but science is particularly challenging on that front. How do you tell a story about something which is very
Can I just say, storytelling is one of the most exciting and fundamental aspects of being human. I was talking with a company called Gartner and about storytelling, and everyone is aware. If I just said to you now, once upon a time, we all love stories, and when you're playing games, you say, let's make up a game, and you'll be this, and you'll be that, and then this happens. Stories are really part of what we are, and because in a sense, a life story anticipates a life story. Yeah, and you have a beginning, a middle, and an end, and you have a journey, which is why we like books. So I think it's very deep-rooted in human DNA to really want to have a beginning, a middle, and an end, a once upon a time, a happy ever after story. Yeah, and in a sense, that's what we're doing with our science. I could tell you my story of how I started off, in Oxford, and then was lucky enough to be able to break into the private sector, and then grew the company. And everyone loves to follow a transition and a story, and I think that's how we make sense of the world, rather than just having random atomized bits of information coming at us. It's how you link them in a sequence, in a linear sequence. And that's what we've done with our science. I could tell you, but I won't, the Neuro-Bio story of how we worked out one thing, and then that led to another thing, and then to another thing. And that's really exciting and fulfilling, but it's certainly not exclusive to science.
Yeah, absolutely. I had one other just interesting maybe comment around marketing is it strikes me again from the outside that there's this huge amounts of money and resource that goes into via charities, etc., into the issue, the very emotive issue of neurodegenerative diseases and Alzheimer's in particular. So there is a huge feeling in the population and money spent behind generating that. But there doesn't seem to be any marketing effort on the other side to sort of talk about the resolution of that. And I think that's fascinating because there is communication out there in the world about this issue. It's just not... there's nobody talking about what then is the consequence and what's happening, which I think is just interesting. Yeah.
Sure, well, that's why it's useful working with you as we are, because as the panel articulated really well, at the moment people are slightly embarrassed about dementia. It's like a lot of mental illnesses. It's something that you don't want to talk about. My mum, in the old days, wouldn't even mention cancer in case you got it. Even by saying the word cancer, she thought she'd get cancer. Yeah? So she'd say the C word. He's got the C word. Yeah? And in a way, mental illness, in particular dementia, is like that. People think even if they talk about it, that's going to somehow, they're going to get it. And that's why I think it's really important, and I hope Neuro-Bio is at the forefront of being there on the public stage, talking about what we do as much as we can, because if you don't do that, then there'll be the opposite of the virtuous circle that the panel just articulated, which is that if people aren't aware of it, then it won't attract funding, which means you won't have the outcomes that you could have if you had the resources.
Yeah. And I guess the last thing I was just going to say, and it'd be good to see if there are any questions from the audience, is marketing is also a long-term endeavour. I think that's interesting. I think our partnership, is a few months old, but hopefully it's much longer.
It's fascinating to see how you guys think, how you design the logo and how you didn't like our previous logo and why. And for us, this is really revolutionary thinking. And it's really, and as always, it's wonderful to have a completely different sector and seeing where they're coming as a problem compared to being in your conventional silo. And that's why I feel very privileged and very pleased that we are working together.
Great.
Yeah.
Thank you, Susan. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
We maybe have time for like one or two questions, and then I think we should probably
Then they want to get back to
have a glass of wine.
brain-stimulating
Any questions
food.
for Susan, or would you like a glass of wine? Yes, please. Yeah.
Just a question. You talk about 10 years
Yes.
And then 10 years later, you see the outcome, maybe 20 years of Alzheimer's. That to me sounds like a conundrum in terms of
No.
time scale.
No. Okay, so the time scale is, the norm is 10 to 20 years from the onset of the slow death of brain cells to the appearance of the cognitive, the memory problems. So what we want to do is to not leave that window open. And a lot of the problems with the current medication is you're closing the door after the horse has bolted. That's to say you're waiting for 10 or 20 years. If we had a blood test that everyone had routinely, then at the beginning of that time window, you could detect the problem. And then if especially you had a medication that stopped any more cells dying, you'd reduce, well, you'd never get the symptoms. So the 10 to 20 years is the existing situation. We would hope that if we get a good medication and a blood test, that would absolutely change that.
But that provides a challenge in terms of testing and demonstrating.
Sure. Yeah, so with the blood test, that is easier because no one dies of giving a blood sample. So you're not, so although there's regulation, it's not the same as the regulation, obviously and understandably, that is around developing a therapy. But even so, once the therapy is past the regulatory period, let's say 5 or 10 years, then it could be something that will be rolled out, we hope. It would be something, in our case, that wouldn't be invoking ethically compromisable things like stem cells or brain transplants or anything too expensive. It would be a simple blood test and then a nasal spray. So once we'd passed the regulatory hurdles, if we were successful, then it would be something that could be rolled out quite quickly.
One more question. Yeah.
Yeah, later.
Oh, sorry.
Leonard.
Please.
So you talk a lot about marketing, you talk about research, you sort of see these very two separate things. And I suppose in my mind, I was kind of thinking that these two pillars of R&D and sales and marketing, the one place where they are really very much brought together is actually big pharma. And so as that kind of, you hand an asset from one company to another company to another company, actually now we look at big pharma as being these powerhouses of marketing, and maybe we get very R&D focused, but perhaps forgetting that those two things are very much brought together in that.
Yeah, I mean, I would just say, I mean, science is complex and simple at the same time. Marketing is a simple premise, which is, what do people want, and how can you, or need, and how can you offer it in a compelling way? And I think whatever the sector you're in, and it applies to pharma and anything else, that remains important. So.
Well, I would say perhaps only big pharma can afford very expensive
that's
marketing.
Also true,
and if we said to our investors who are venture capitalists, well, we want to spend a lot of time on marketing, I don't think they'd be that impressed.
No, but I think the point is, so there's a time and a place for the right kind of marketing.
Sure.
And when you're trying to develop an asset to actually prove that concept, as you say, like, do you even need a logo? It's like making those choices, right?
Yeah, actually, do you need a logo is a very good question. And I think we do. We've recently had, well, you'll all be able to take away a very tasteful Neuro-Bio t-shirt, yeah? Navy blue with white leg. And in a sense, that's important because it does give you a sense of working to a common purpose. So I think you could just, well, as academics might, you don't need a logo. But I think we do. I think it's something that symbolizes and acts as a cohesive way of, actually bringing us all together.
Yeah, have a logo, but make sure you have something behind it. If you just have a logo, nothing behind it, then, and there are companies that do that, and that's, clearly not good.
But do enjoy the t-shirt and the goodie bag.
Great t-shirt. Great logo, by the way.
Tasteful,
Really good logo.
very tasteful t-shirt. Leonard, you had a... Our plan. Okay, so as a company that is contemplating having a medication, there's no way we could do anything beyond so-called phase 1 clinical trials. Phase 1 is where you're testing that there's no adverse side effects of the medication you're developing, nothing to do with efficacy. But to go to the more sophisticated stages where you're testing efficacy, a company such as ours will have to partner or license or exit to a bigger company. So that's just the way of the world. And the clinical trials are monumentally expensive beyond phase 1. So I think what we would do is actually think of all the different options, but think also of the other things we're doing, such as the animal model or the cancer application, so that we're not going to just give wholesale one thing, everything, to one company.
Okay, I think we're going to repair to the back of the room and have a glass of wine.
And brain food.
And thank you
and the
again.
brain food.
And brain food, yeah. And thank you again, Susan.
And thank you,
very
Jason.
much,
Thank you.